Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining my session. I'm going to be talking today for a little while about what I think is what's next in education, on a couple of issues about how I think we got to the point we're at, where I think things are likely to go next, and hopefully that will be a useful sort of start for 10 for some conversations amongst school leaders in Birmingham. Just to give you an indication of who I am. My name is John Blake. I think it's important that I sort of talk to you about my background so that you're aware of where I'm coming from, because some of the things I'm going to say and the topics that I've chosen to focus on are the ones that I feel are important. That doesn't mean they're the only ones. In fact, they're definitely not the only ones. And my views are, in this case, they're very much my views, and they're open to change, challenge, and discussion. But anyway, I'm currently the head of public affairs and engagement at ARK, which is a multi-academy trust and wider charity with schools across London, Hastings, Portsmouth, and in Birmingham. Previously, before starting the public affairs job, I was ARC's curriculum research and design lead, and I'd also previously worked as director of policy and strategy for Now Teach, the career changer support organisation for late stage career changers moving into teaching. Prior to that, I worked at Think Tank, and before that, I've been a history teacher and middle and senior leader for 10 years in various different places and across various different types of schools. I'm a history teacher by background, but I have also done qualifications education. So that's my background. That's my starting point. That's my experience, and hopefully that will set in context some of my thinking, some of the things that I'll say. So the way I'd like to structure this session is I'm going to talk for a little bit about how we got here, the way in which the current structures in our education system emerged, and a little bit about curriculum and assessment. Again, to be clear, I'm not saying those are the only two topics that one could talk about. They're definitely not. They're certainly not even the only most important topics necessarily. They are, however, the ones that I think offer a really good chance to see how policy has changed over time and where it might go in the future, and I think offer a really good opportunity to address, in particular, some of the responses that we need to make in the post-pandemic age. So at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the chances are, or the challenges and opportunities are for networking schools into the future, and so on and so forth. So to start, and again, forgive me if people know this, I'm not here to teach granny to suck eggs, but I think it is useful to take a look back over a slightly longer haul to get a sense of how the system we currently operate in terms of structures has emerged, and why structures continues to be a topic of debate in our education system. So it's worth stating that although at the moment we obviously have a very interesting setup across the country where just over half of schools are academies, and the remaining half, therefore, are mostly local authority maintained schools. That half and half isn't precisely split between primary and secondary. More secondary schools are academies as a percentage than primaries. And there are very few places where there's a sort of dominance of one or the other. So we are currently very much across almost all of the country in a mixed economy, where local authority maintained schools and academies will sit cheek by jowl and will feed into each other, and will relate to each other. And then within those academies, that academy sector, obviously, there is a variety of trusts. Some are large national trusts with schools across multiple regions, such as ARK. Others are prominent trusts that tend to be clustered in particular geographic locations. So the Harris Federation, for whom I previously worked, by and large focused in London and mostly in South London, or there are some trusts that are largely focused in areas of the north, and some trusts obviously have schools everywhere, and others are very, very localized trusts, either single academy trusts or just a couple of schools. So there's a lot of variation in the way we currently structure that. And of course, local authority maintained schools also have significant variation within them, depending on the political complexion of the local authority, its the choices it's made over the past 10 to 15 years about how to run its education service and system, and its inheritance or otherwise of success or not in the way that that system is run. The government, I think, remains keen, and this is not a statement of personal preference, it's just, I think, a statement of the reading of the political runes, remains keen on moving to a fully academised system. That is a single legal standard for schools where all schools would be in the same legal relationship to the central government. That's been a constant topic of conversation within this government since Nicky Morgan announced that intention. Well, I think George Osborne announced that intention on Nicky Morgan's behalf some years ago. They then withdrew from a full implementation of that, but it still remains their stated aim. And that, I think, should frame thinking about where we're likely to go next. But it is worth pointing out that, and I think this is what this slightly crude graph attempts to do, is just to say that structural change has been fairly constant in the English education system since at least the end of the Second World War. So people will be familiar with the idea, obviously, that we emerged from the Second World War and the government established what was often called the tripartite system of selective grammar schools, secondary moderns for those students who did not meet the 11 plus standard, and then technical schools for students who were technically able. Technical schools were essentially a dead letter in most places, and there will be some examples of them, but by and large, the tripart system was bipartite, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with that. At the same time, an additional aspect of that, which I've shown here in the blue boxes, is central government investment. So by and large, in the post-war world, central government's role in education was extraordinarily indirect. Famously, Tim Brighouse pointed out that in the post-war world, the education secretary had very few powers, and they included mostly just signing the checks. I think the other one is permitting or instructing the building of air raid shelters. So central government was by and large absent, but they did have a function in funding the direct grant grammar schools, who were an inheritance from an earlier age. And then, of course, there was the independent sector, as it was. Long arguments about whether or not comprehensive schools should exist. Comprehensives were in place from immediately after the war, and indeed in some cases before the war, often on the grounds of cost rather than necessarily ideological. It's easier to provide one school than it is to provide two. And both the cost rationale and as Peter Mandler, the Cambridge historian, has shown in his recent book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, or The Crisis of Meritocracy, which is about post-war education, there was also huge parental pressure that demanded a change in that system. So into the 1970s, we see enormous expansion of the comprehensive system and a corresponding huge decline in the selective system, to the point where very few places retain selective education. And the direct grant grammars are forced to make a choice, either to come into the system as comprehensives or to depart outwards and become fully independent. There was then a period under Margaret Thatcher in which grant maintained schools were introduced, so another intervention into central government direct funding that didn't survive the advent of New Labour, but New Labour found other ways to provide for a central government relationship with the school sector, through the foundation schools. They inherited the city technology colleges, of which there were a very small number, but they were ultimately the inspiration for the government city academies program, which birthed the academies program we know today, which itself birthed the free schools. So there has been an ongoing debate really since the 1950s about where funding for schooling should sit and what relationship to the structures and maintenance of schooling that should have. Between the local authorities and sort of local accountability and local engagement, and central government accountability, central government funding, and central government engagement. And all the while, the independent sector has at times weaved in and out, either by some of its schools moving into the state sector or moving out of the state sector, increasingly through the independent sector, taking an interest in schools, either through collaborative programs or through directly running schools itself, as Eton College does with a free school near it, and indeed Eton and a number of other independent schools with something like the London Academy of Excellence in Newham. So various up and downs, lots of debate. As I say, I think the trend is still very much towards the expansion of the academy system, and I think that is worth thinking about as we go into the post-pandemic age. And the reason I think that's important is because I think there are some big issues. I mean, sometimes people will say that structures aren't important, that investing too much time and focus and energy and effort in structures is to take away from a focus on standards and improvement. I think ultimately, although I have some sympathy for aspects of that, I think it is a misguided view, because I think structures do determine a huge amount of what we can do. And I've listed here, I think, 4 issues that I think structures touch on quite importantly. Again, they're not the only issues I could have listed. I'm not there. Others will have different views, but these are the ones that stand out to me as an example of why the structures we choose are so important. So to begin with, I think the pandemic response has made it very, very clear that networking schools, howsoever it's done, is really important. So the evidence I think that is emerging now is that in general, and of course there will be exceptions to this, but in general, it was the schools that were able to draw on additional capacity and support through being within some form of network who were able to succeed. Now, those networks weren't always academy trusts. There were other forms of network, some formed informally, some through slightly harder agreements between schools. But then in general, those schools were able to approach the challenges of the pandemic with greater success overall than were isolated schools, whether they be single academy trusts or schools within local authorities who did not have the resource or capacity to provide additional support to them. So structures clearly do matter, and I think the post-pandemic age will only really reinforce that. I think another area where that's clear is on SEND. SEND and exclusion are clearly not the same subject, but I think they are often thought of together because there are serious concerns across the system that we are not succeeding for our SEND students, and that in many cases they are being excluded from mainstream education unnecessarily because of that. Again, I think there are lots of views about where that line should be drawn. I don't propose to get into that. What I am saying, I think, is that wheresoever one comes down on the line of what is excludable behaviour or otherwise, it is clear that our special educational needs students are a responsibility for the whole system and the whole community, and where we have seen success in supporting special educational needs students, there is a clear sense of a school network around those provisions that leaders and young people can draw on, and can share best practice within, and can identify useful improvement strategies. Teacher training and development is an area that is foremost in the government's mind. I'm sure everyone here will be familiar with the introduction of the Early Careers Framework and the rollout that has taken place this year to all now ECTs, no longer NQTs, to ensure they have access to 2 solid years of high quality mentoring and provision as they begin their careers. But the government has also built what is termed the golden thread reforms, in which ITT and ECF tie together very tightly through the core content framework, and now through the work of the ITT market review, which, to declare an interest, I was a member of the panel for. So that those things should tie together to mean that we do have what was called for in the Carter Review a number of years ago, which is a longer, more sustained, more cohesive, more coherent training period for teachers. That should then lead into the new national professional qualifications, which draw on and build on that work, and then into the national professional headship qualification. So it should be the point, if it's not quite cradle to grave for teachers, it should at least be from the moment one picks up the whiteboard pen at the beginning of your career towards relatively near the end of it, one is getting a consistent sense of coherent development over time. And networking schools is clearly going to be essential for that, in terms of allowing staff to see and experience different circumstances in which they can apply that training, and to experience a broad range of successful procedures and processes for implementing that work. And then the fourth area, which I'll talk a little bit more about in greater depth, because it's the area that I spent a lot of my the last few years working on, is curriculum and assessment planning and implementation. Everyone will be familiar with the new Ofsted framework, with its very strong focus on curriculum quality. Obviously slightly interrupted by the pandemic, but Ofsted have now resumed their full inspections on that basis. And assessment is clearly a matter of great concern, because we haven't seen, the SATs haven't run for the past 2 years, the GCSEs haven't run for the past 2 years, the A-levels haven't run for the past 2 years. So the kind of assessments that we are used to using haven't been there, but assessment obviously remains a crucial part of education. We still need to understand what the students know and can do, and therefore be able to improve on it. So just to touch again on a brief history, just to look back. Again, curriculum is not a new topic of discussion. I think it became more fraught later than the question of structures. So as I say here, I think before the 1970s, although there was some discussion of curriculum appropriateness, partly because the grammar school curriculum and the academic curriculum was seen as synonymous, lots of the conversations that we currently have weren't really there. The question was more about access to such a curriculum. But the advent of the comprehensive movement did also lead or provide an opportunity for schools to try out different ways of composing the curriculum, and led to a reaction, as people found that and parts of that unacceptable. So we have Jim Callaghan's Ruskin speech, which commits central government to a strong involvement in curriculum. The Black Papers, so named in opposition to government white papers, which made some incredibly strong criticisms, some more coherent than others, against the education system, and led ultimately to the 1988 Education Reform Act, which introduced the key stages as we know it. All that said, curriculum and assessment have too often been discussed separately, and both discussed separately from the question of implementation. So although the national curriculum brought us key stages and some periodic assessment, there was no testing of the whole curriculum at any point. It was then, still is now, perfectly possible to navigate through a school teaching you the entire national curriculum and never be tested in any formal way on the quality of your understanding of history or geography or RE. And until the recent education inspection framework changes, Ofsted did not really interest itself in the content of the curriculum. And particularly from the advent of New Labour in 1997, there was a strong focus on English and maths as the primary function, which tended to have, and again, generalization here, tended to have the effect of narrowing the curriculum in certain schools to focus only on those topics and not on other subjects. What that led to by 2010 was a very unusual situation in that our system lacked both equity and excellence, and in general, one gets one problem or the other. So either it's excellent but not very equally distributed, or it's very equally distributed but the quality isn't particularly high. Whereas we were spending a lot of money for not very good outcomes overall, and where we did have those good outcomes, they were being hoarded at the wealthier end of the spectrum, and that led to the introduction of the 2014 national curriculum, which was underpinned by international evidence seeking curriculum coherence, so that a curriculum would probably flow throughout the entire time of a student's time at school. Why is that important? People who have heard me speak before may have seen this image before, because only in schools can you engage over an extended period of time in a particular subject and returning to a topic more than once at a higher level of cognitive complexity, so that you are improving over time. And I think where we still had a problem with 2014 was that implementation and assessment was still not in an ideal place. And I think that it still wasn't necessarily clear whether students were learning the appropriate amount, what the appropriate amount to learn would be at a given age, and so on and so forth. So to just give you an example of some of the work that ARK does, again, I'm not saying this is revelatory. I'm sure many schools do this, and I know that many other trusts do this, but just as a sort of example of the ways in which we've tried to use our capacity to network to deliver improvement on curriculum and assessment. We have common curricula in English, Maths and Science, which are provided by a partner charity of ARK's, ARK Curriculum Plus, built by ARK teachers using their expertise, and now available to the wider system through ARK Curriculum Plus. We have network subject groups who are working to achieve common curricula in other subjects. But we felt that it wasn't enough just to have or just to say we're going to have common curricula. We wanted agreed assessment content, format and timing. We know that when you take an assessment, how much jeopardy young people or their parents think is involved in an assessment, what content they believe it will cover versus what it will cover. All of these things can affect the validity and reliability of assessments. So we have attempted to agree those things across the network, because that means we can then benchmark the data against all of the different schools. Because we have a large number of schools, we have therefore a very sizable pool of students to benchmark against. Our students don't match the national profile, and by and large our students are more disadvantaged because of where our schools are and have a different demographic composition overall, but it at least allows us to provide some benchmarking within that. We are then able to have a dedicated data and insight team at network level. So schools obviously are expected to examine their data and think about what to do with it, but we also provide additional support and inquiry into the quality of data across the network and in individual schools to support them. And we have cross-network training and best practice sharing in response. So again, I think there are a number of ways one can achieve that kind of networking potential and capacity, but I think it is essential in order to make schools more than the sum of their parts, and also to allow teachers in an individual school to have access to insights, training and expertise that they simply wouldn't be able to get were the school just a standalone entity. So to finish off, what do I think happens next? What do I think people sitting here this afternoon might want to be prepared for? So to reiterate, as I've said again and again, I think this question of networking for schools is essential, however it's done. And again, I have my views on this. I'm sure many people in the audience have very strong views on this. I think there is more than one way to do it, although I have a view of which is the more successful way. Um, that's one discussion. But it is clear that the government continues to favour trusts, but not single academy trusts. So I would advise schools that are thinking about where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years' time to consider that they're likely to be in a landscape where there will be far fewer single academy trusts, um, and but there will also be far fewer local authority maintained schools. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean there will be a series of mega national trusts, and in fact, I think that's not the preference amongst either the trust sector or in the government, but that there would be a wide variety of larger regional entities that were operating. Again, I'm sure people have lots of views about whether that's the right thing to do or not, but I think that in reading the runes at the moment seems to me likely to be where we're going. With regard to curriculum and assessment and the importance of that networking, I think that is essential because the English system has relied very strongly on very long time series of data that we've had. So we've had GCSE data right from the beginning of the 90s. We've had SATs data from the beginning of the 90s. We actually have older data in A levels and O levels that goes back on that. We have a lot of data and the stuff from more recently for very large cohorts of students. That is both useful and interesting in and of itself, but also provides a strong basis for our accountability system. We are now just missing massive chunks of that. It's going to be very hard to work out how Progress 8 will operate when we don't have the data from primary schools on which it was calculated. We are already seeing some of the consequences of trying to work out how to make comparable the results for students. It was very difficult for students who weren't doing exams for us to be certain that results were comparable, and we saw in both 2000 and 2020 and 2021, real exacerbation of already pre-existing divides within educational outcomes because we were attempting to operate without exams. But even with exams, we still will have a level of variation beyond the norm because some schools are going to continue to have to suffer bigger problems with COVID and with its consequences into the future. So lots of the assumptions that underpin our assessment processes are open to question. I remain very strongly of the view that examination is an essential tool for fairness towards young people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, because the evidence suggests that for lots of reasons, teacher assessment tends to come out to their disadvantage. But that doesn't mean we aren't going to have to solve a lot of problems to do with how we use that data and what that data means. And in many ways, we are not well set up for that conversation because our system has relied very, very strongly on that data up to this point. And I think networking and being able to share data, being able to share discussions about that data, its consequences, is likely to be a really valuable tool. So, as I say, there are lots of other topics that one can think about, and I'm not saying these are the only things that one should think about, and I know that school leaders, these won't be the only things that you're thinking about, but I do think for me, that question of how we network our schools, and particularly how we network our schools in the face of a very, very changed system of data collection and interpretation, are ones I think are really big topics and that I think need a lot of attention and focus. And I hope that's been a useful overview for you. Thank you very much.